So, as I said, for the last 15 months, we have been studying world religions. We've looked at Hinduism, we've looked at Buddhism, we've looked at Orthodoxy. Last month we looked at the Sikhs, and today we arrive at the Protestants. Many of us here this morning came here from one Protestant faith or another. The history surrounding the rethinking of how to be a religious Christian is so complex that I thought it might be interesting and hopefully a bit fun to look at how Protestant Christian theology expressed itself through music throughout the centuries. As we know, music taps into a deep place in the human psyche that words alone just can't reach. Music comforts us, spurs us to action, is entertaining, and also reinforces our beliefs and understanding of life. So we began the service with Be Thou My Vision. That's actually a Celtic hymn that dates from the 6th or 7th century. Celtic spirituality, as opposed to some of the other theologies that we're going to look at in a few minutes, has always been deeply connected to nature and also really honors the feminine face of God. So because Ireland was so isolated from Rome, Celtic Christianity was really more closely connected to early Eastern Christianity than to Roman Christianity. So here we find God a constant present because there was no sense of separation between the sacred and the secular. God was not removed, but always with us. God in me dwelling, even though we forgot the last half of the verse. The last verse we sang highlights that reality. That verse could be understood as referring to Jesus. But in the 6th or 7th century of Celtic spirituality, people believed that the sacred one dwells within each person and that each of us is in unity with the divine. For those of you who know of my studies on the Aramaic Jesus, this Celtic belief is very much in harmony with early Semitic understandings of Jesus. So these beliefs differ from the institutional Christianity that developed on the continent in the almost 1,000 years after Be Thou My Vision was originally sung. So from Be Thou My Vision, we're going to leap forward to 1517 and the Protestant Reformation. It was attributed to Martin Luther. The reality is that, like any great movement in human history, there were already tensions within the Roman Church that had been festering from the great schism of the Western Church that existed from 1378 to 1416. So freethinkers like Jan Hus in Prague wished to use the common vernacular rather than Latin in worship and to serve wine at communion. And that's a whole separate service. And one of the roots of our chalice, the development of our chalice as the symbol for Unitarian Universalism, comes from Jan Hus, who was burned at the stake for his beliefs. English theologian John Wycliffe had called for the scriptures to be printed in the common vernacular and was anti-clerical. Some of our own early fellowship roots in this country sometimes have been fairly anti-clerical. So add to this early theological unrest the rise of Ferdinand and Isabella to the throne in Spain. So whereas all religions under the Ottoman Empire had been honored They pushed the free religious thinkers, Jews and Muslims, out of Spain unless the people were forced to convert. And they then installed the Spanish Inquisition, killing those who were outside orthodoxy or who questioned the traditions of the church. I want to also add that the invention of the printing press and expanded literacy actually helped the Protestant Reformation succeed, because suddenly people could learn more about the Christian faith. They could even read the Bible. They didn't need clergy to interpret for them. So Luther emerges as a symbol of the protests of those who questioned the theology, power, and beliefs of the Western Church. There was rebellion against the selling of indulgences, the enforced celibacy of the clergy, the need for saints or clergy to intercede for the people with God. They protested papal authority and monasticism. Luther brought an emphasis on salvation by faith alone, the importance of good works, the primacy of the sacraments, and a rebellion against hierarchy. So even though some of the rebellion was funded and fueled by the princes of city-states, the rebellion unleashed years, maybe centuries, of pent-up anger among the poor and others who had been ground down by the taxes and various forms of oppression by both church and state. So what emerges from this grassroots movement of rebellion is a new way to engage with the teachings of Jesus. And over the centuries, the church's theology had moved from a belief that God is always among us, loving and supporting us, to a distant God who punishes those who don't have the right belief or who we must approach with awe. The chants and hymns of the Catholic Church shifted to Protestant hymns that had a different cadence and articulated a different theology. So the first hymn that we're going to look at, and please don't stand up as we look at these. The first hymn, let's look at hymn number 200. And we're not going to, wait just one second. We're looking first, then we're going to sing. So this is one of Martin Luther's hymns. It's probably familiar to those people here who grew up in a Christian faith. Contrary to popular beliefs and what my seminary professors told me, this was not an adapted beer tavern song. There's all this controversy through the centuries whether, Luther's hymns were that. So here we see an unapologetic rebellion against the Roman Catholic Church. God is on our side, a bulwark that will never fail, and we are opposed to our foe, the church, that is armed with cruel hate. There is nothing subtle in this hymn. This is often called the battle hymn of the Reformation, and much death and destruction came about in the rebellion against the power of the Pope, monastics, and clerics. So it's in our hymn, it's in our hymnal, which we might think is a little strange because its theology is very different from modern Unitarian Universalist theology. But, it's really part of the cultural literacy of people who grew up with connections to Christianity over the centuries. So let's sing it now, Paula. not a conciliatory or loving hymn, is it? Yeah, it's not one of those let's live together peacefully hymns. So let's say a couple of words about the hymns in our hymnal. We've already seen this morning that sometimes I don't, pick all the hymns appropriately. And, often people will say that we Unitarian Universalists sanitize the hymns. Well, the reality is that Unitarian Universalist beliefs and theological positions have shifted for centuries, and especially during the 20th century. So have the hymns of other faith traditions. I remember doing a memorial service, actually since I've been here, and it was in another location, and the person, we were just singing for all the saints. I had forgotten the verses that other faith traditions sing for all the saints. And so another clergy person picked the verses we were to sing, and they were actually offensive to the family of the deceased, and it was, but it was what it was. So hymns in our hymnal have been changed. So if the UU joke is true that we are people who can't sing because we're reading ahead to see if we agree with the words, this is the truth, then it makes sense for us to adapt the words in our hymnal so we'll have the best chance at singing that we can have. So, for instance, one of the hymns, and Paula played it during the Music for Meditation, we talked about maybe including Holy, Holy, Holy as one of the hymns for this morning, but she played it and we're not singing the words. But if you look at Holy, Holy, Holy in the hymnal, it's number 26 if you want to look at it. The first line that we sing is Holy, 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 Author of Creation. Okay, I know there's some Protestants in here. That is not the line that I grew up singing. I grew up singing Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. So the last line of the hymn, if you will look at it, is Holy, 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 Merciful and Mighty, who was and is and evermore shall be. Traditionally, it was Merciful and Mighty, God in three persons, Blessed Trinity. So, as non-Trinitarian believers, we had to do something. It's a hymn that's so old, it's in the public domain. So we sanitized that line. So that's where we get some of our hymns. But going back to the Protestant Reformation, as Luther was doing his stuff, in Switzerland, Zwingli became another protest movement. He led another protest movement, thinking that other Protestants, like Luther, were actually too conservative. The Anabaptists and the Calvinists were birthed by this thread of protest. Historically, these traditions have long had standing tensions, first with Unitarians in Europe and then with Unitarians and Universalists in America. So the most prominent theological conflict with Calvin ended up with the burning at the stake of Unitarian Michael Servetus by John Calvin in 1553 because of Servetus's book, The Errors of the Trinity, that stated the Trinity is not scripturally based, which is what Unitarians have thought since the 1500s. So for Servetus to talk about that, that's quite a heresy if you believe in scriptural inerrancy. So we have Calvinism, who later became the Presbyterians, and like the Lutherans today, one can find many different threads of Presbyterians, such as the Presbyterian Church in the United States, who are liberal, ordaining women and now marrying all couples, Fort Hill Presbyterian, and the Presbyterian Church in America, that's very conservative, focusing on tradition that, among other things, denies women's ordination. So let's look at hymn 115, God of Grace and God of Glory. Now, this is a real interesting one because it came from a different century. And though it was written by a Baptist minister, this hymn was the one recommended by the music director at Fort Hill Presbyterian as example of more modern Presbyterian theology. So composer Henry Emerson Fosdick was very ecumenical in his ministry and penned the hymn during the Depression between the two world wars. So think of what was happening and how people of faith were trying to struggle with an impending Second World War, the Depression, the ravages of the First World War. What's different about this hymn is that what one might have sung during the colonial period is it doesn't contain a focus on condemnation and predestination. Judgment of the individual is not in this hymn other than the wealthy, people who are greedy. Replaced is Fosdick's commitment to the social gospel. Here is a connection to many Unitarian Universalist beliefs of the time. A commitment to do something about the plight of the poor, the disenfranchised, and to also address the privilege of the few. Though calling us to justice, this hymn doesn't hold the guilt and judgment of hymns of earlier centuries. Rather, it's a petition that believers might find the strength, the internal strength, to do the justice work that needs to be done. So let's sing the first and third verses of 115. Did that hymn feel very different from the first one? Yeah, real different. One very much raging against the church, one calling believers to action. So let's step back in history again. Other theological perspectives were emerging during the Protestant Reformation on the continent. Christianity came early to the British Isles, as we saw in Be Thou My Vision. And it actually wasn't until the late 7th century that the British monarch gave allegiance to the authority of the Roman Church. Though the Church of England was initiated by Henry VIII, and wow, that would be a fun sermon. The reality is that the spiritual and religious history of the British Isles had different influences than Christianity on the continent. The mysticism of the British Church, of Celtic spirituality with its history of pilgrimage to sacred sites, as well as a continued honoring of the sacred feminine as seen in the teachings of women saints, all influenced the spiritual life of those in the British Isles. In the mid-14th century, English theologian John Wycliffe questioned papal authority and the church's involvement in the secular world. Long before Henry VIII came to the throne, the English spiritual influences were not as grounded in Roman theology as that of European Christians. So the hymn we chose for the theology of the Church of England balances a belief in the omnipotence of God with a deity who is also accessible to humanity. As with many other hymns, this is an adaptation of one of the Psalms, which were in a reality, the Psalms were the ancient hymns that Christians adapted from their Jewish heritage and history. So let's sing the first 3 verses of 281. O God, our help in ages past. So now we move to America. Though we've not included a hymn of the Congregationalist tradition, sorry, Paula, there was much controversy in America's early history in New England between the Unitarians and the Congregationalists. Peace Congregational Church, which is United Church of Christ, came out of that Congregationalist tradition. While today we find more and more UU and UCC congregations merging, during the early days of this country's history, there was a good deal of tension. And we also found in early American history the tension between the circuit riding ministers of different faiths who would travel from town to town preaching and receiving converts. Now, you also have to remember that there wasn't much entertainment in the early days of America, so sometimes preaching contests were great fun. So the greatest tension often, as the circuit riders went around from town to town, were between the Universalists and the Calvinists. One preaching universal salvation and the other eternal damnation. It must have been very confusing during those days. As survival in colonial times was often tenacious, we see theology shifting beginning in the 1700s from a distant God to a personal relationship with Jesus, God incarnate. The Great Awakening in this country focused on spiritual awareness and personal salvation. That shift in theology was articulated through thousands of hymns learned at evangelical gatherings, tent revivals, and Pentecostal events. The person known as the mother of congregational hymn singing was Fanny Crosby, who lived from 1820 to 1950, and she's the person I mentioned to the children who actually was blind from the time she was, I've forgotten whether it was 6 or 8 years old. Her hymns evoked a personal relationship with Jesus, a promise of salvation for believers, and affirmed that faith was not simply about works, but should be focused on the personal religious experience. Though Fanny Crosby was the most prolific hymn writer of any generation, she also dedicated the last decades of her life to inner city mission work. One of her most famous hymns, Rescue the Perishing, was written about the homeless men with whom she worked. Now, I have to say that hymn scared me when I was a kid. Rescue the perishing, care for the dying. That and all the blood hymns that were in a lot of Protestant hymnals during that day. So for those of you who did not grow up singing the blood hymns, count yourselves lucky. They are focused on the importance of Jesus dying for our sins. And as we can see, these hymns differ greatly from the ones that we've already looked at. God is now approachable through Jesus. The Baptist faith was brought to America from England, and actually the first Baptist church in the South was built in Charleston in 1696. Today, there are several threads of Baptists in the country. First Baptist Church at Clemson is a cooperative Baptist congregation, which is a break-off from the Southern Baptists. Cooperative Baptists ordain women, do interfaith work, and are much more liberal. So in addition to the Southern Baptists, there are also the liberal American Baptists, which tend to be in the north. So one of Fanny Crosby's most beloved hymns is Blessed Assurance. The words are printed in the bulletin, though some of us could probably remember the words. Here the hymn reminds believers that Jesus purchased salvation by his blood sacrifice. Hence the focus on praising Jesus. So these words are actually printed in the order of service. There had to be a little blood in one of the hymns. So now we move to Methodism. Founded in England in the mid-1700s by John Wesley with the support of his brother Charles Wesley and friends. And this was really an attempt to bring reform to the Church of England. Believing that one is justified by faith alone, Wesley preached that piety produces inward and outward holiness. This commitment from the earliest days that salvation was open to all people convinced Methodists that they should help the poor and the average people, and they were committed to building loving relationships with others through social service as a means of working and helping people move toward including God's love as part of their lives. So here we see the missionary spirit prevalent in America, founded in the belief that Methodists should follow Jesus' command to spread the good news and serve all people. And actually, sort of like the name Unitarian, the name Methodist, what started out as a joke, mocking Wesley and his followers because of their structured, the way they structured their religious lives. I also want to say that between 1968 and 1972, the Methodist Church merged with the Evangelical United Methodist Church to become the United Methodist Church. Ralph Stutzman of our congregation was originally ordained in Evangelical United Brethren. I was ordained Methodist, and then with the merger of the United Methodist Church and then the merger of the Unitarian Universalists, here we are, Unitarian Universalist ministers. Charles Wesley was a great composer, the brother of John, and many of his hymns affirm Methodist beliefs. His hymn, "Oh, for a Thousand Tongues to Sing," relays the commitment of Methodists to spread the gospel. So let us now share the first verse or maybe it's two verses. For a Thousand Tongues to Sing. It's printed in the order. So, over the years, it is what it is. So, over the years, just like Unitarians and Universalists, Protestant faiths have evolved. So we started out with this sort of militant, marching Lutheran hymn. When I called a Lutheran minister colleague of mine, I said, okay, what Lutheran hymn should we include? He said, Amazing Grace. He was not claiming A Mighty Fortress is Our God. Because, theology shifts. And for, Protestants also. Another colleague from another faith tradition said, oh, Amazing Grace. Because particularly liberal Protestants now are focused on love, hope, forgiveness, justice. It's a different kind of understanding of faith. So there's an acknowledgement of a different way of being in the world to find unity with our brothers and sisters. So let's just sing the first hymn, which you probably don't, some of it you don't need your hymnal to sing the first verse of Amazing Grace. So also note that the word wretch, which is commonly sung in Amazing Grace, has been replaced by the word soul, which again is that shift from original sin to original blessing. So let's just sing one verse.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a soul like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see.
So now, maybe we should look at, even though we're going a little long, I apologize. What might we sing, like the Protestant Reformation had the battle hymn of the Protestant Reformation? What is sort of the national anthem of Unitarian Universalists, a hymn? Many people would say Spirit of Life. That is probably the most beloved hymn. It's short. What? Yes, because we're bad at singing, we want. But it also talks about justice, the indwelling of love and compassion that we call the Spirit of Life, or our higher power, or God, or whatever name it goes by. And there's an acknowledgement that we both need to stay connected to our faith and to feel free to question our beliefs and to acknowledge also that we are not isolated beings. So let us share hymn 123, Spirit of Life.